If you've ever stood before that glowing white spiral on Fifth Avenue, the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, you've already seen the afterimage of a forgotten empire. It's more than a museum. It's a monument to ambition, to reinvention, to 7 brothers who once controlled the veins of the earth, pulling out gold, silver, and copper in such quantities that they briefly became America's second-richest family, behind only Rockefeller. You see, what most visitors don't realize as they climb that spiral ramp, staring at Kandinsky and Pollock, is that this building wasn't born from art.
It was
Born from molten metal, from deals struck in Alaskan mines and Bolivian tin pits, from a family that turned raw elements into unmatched industrial power, and then, in one of history's most successful rebrands, converted that power into cultural immortality. In 1918, 7 brothers held a secret meeting behind the stone walls of a New York mansion. The purpose, to decide who would control a fortune so massive it could shift the balance of power in global trade. Behind closed doors, they weren't just discussing mines. They were deciding the price of silver in Shanghai, the fate of copper in Chile, and whether a small smelting plant in Mexico would live or die. These weren't politicians, they weren't monarchs.
They were Guggenheims.
And together, they had more influence over the industrial world than some governments. But how did a family of Swiss immigrants climb to the very peak of American capitalism? How did a group of brothers, once peddling lace and stove polish, come to dominate global metals and reshape art, politics, and even outer space? This is Hidden Billionaire. And today we're decoding the rise of the Guggenheim Bros, the immigrant sons who built a fortune so vast it outlived the industry that created it. To understand that, we need to go back to the beginning, where ambition met iron ore and forged an empire. Forget Silicon Valley billionaires with algorithm-driven fortunes. Forget oil dynasties with desert empires. At their peak, the Guggenheim family controlled more raw wealth beneath the earth than most small nations above it. By 1918, Forbes ranked them as America's second-richest family, just behind the Rockefellers. Estimates at the time placed their fortune somewhere between $250 million and $300 million, but adjusted for inflation. That's the equivalent of over $5 to $6 billion today, concentrated within a single family. And unlike many old money legacies, who simply inherited titles or trusts, the Guggenheims built theirs in one generation through sheer commercial aggression, cold strategy, and complete vertical integration. This wasn't generational wealth, this was engineered wealth. At the heart of their empire was metal, silver, copper, lead, tin, and gold, the things the modern world couldn't function without. Their company, the American Smelting and Refining Company, didn't just own mines, it processed, refined, and moved metals across continents. They didn't take a slice of the industry, they swallowed the whole pie. Let's put there, reach into perspective. The story begins far from Wall Street or the glimmering museums that now bear their name. In the mid-1800s, a Jewish man named Meyer Guggenheim arrived in America from Switzerland. He didn't come with riches. He didn't even come with a plan. He came because Europe had rejected him. Meyer was the kind of man who didn't wait for opportunity, he hunted it. Starting as a traveling salesman in Pennsylvania, he sold housewares door to door. Then he noticed something. American homes were hungry for imported lace and embroidery. So he built a business. He sent 2 of his sons back to Switzerland to run factories. And while other families built slow, cautious businesses, Meyer built an empire like a general prepares for war, relying on one resource most businessmen never trusted: his own children. But the embroidery game was just the beginning. In 1881, Meyer accepted 2 struggling silver mines in Colorado as debt repayment. At first, he considered it a loss. But within a few years, those mines were pouring out silver like rivers. This move would change everything, but it wasn't silver that made him rich. It was strategy. And his next decision would show just how different the Guggenheims were, because unlike other mine owners, Meyer decided to build the smelters himself. What came next was something that even the Rockefellers didn't expect. At their height, the Guggenheims controlled nearly 80% of the global supply of silver and lead, massive chunk of the world's copper production, tin operations in Bolivia, gold extraction in the Yukon smelters in Mexico, and the U.S. diamond routes in Africa. Railroads and shipping networks linking it all together. Their mining empire was like a metallic octopus, with tentacles stretching into nearly every continent. They didn't just extract, they controlled the full chain: mines, smelters, railroads, shipping lanes, even banking relationships in Europe. Every piece of the puzzle tied to one name: Guggenheim. And the scale of it all, mind-bending. In today's money, their asset base would stretch well beyond the tens of billions of dollars. In fact, the family name lives on in modern finance. Guggenheim Partners, a financial services firm rooted in this original family fortune, now manages over $300 billion in assets. Another family-controlled entity, Guggenheim Investment Advisors, casually oversees another $50 billion. These aren't your typical family offices. These are financial machines with the legacy of a mining dynasty behind them. And yet, this empire that eventually employed tens of thousands of workers from Colorado to the Congo began with a desperate gamble and a little bit of luck. In 1881, Patriarch Meyer Guggenheim accepted a debt payment from a Colorado businessman, not in cash, but in mining rights, specifically 2 silver mines that, at the time, looked like more trouble than they were worth. Meyer considered it a loss. But within a few years, those mines were pumping out silver in volumes that stunned even seasoned prospectors. What followed wasn't luck, it was strategy. Most mining barons made their money at the source and relied on third-party smelters to process the raw,
not the Guggenheims.
Meyer and his sons realized that the real profit lived in owning the infrastructure, so they built their own smelting operations, starting in Colorado and eventually expanding into Mexico. This meant they controlled not just how the metal was extracted, but how it was processed, priced, and distributed. No middlemen, no guesswork, just pure industrial dominance. The Guggenheims didn't play the mining game. They redefined it. Their operations became so powerful, they eventually took on Rockefeller-backed interests and won. Through their firm Guggenheim Exploration Company, they seized control of American Smelting and Refining Company, the dominant metal processing corporation in the U.S. at the time. It was an industrial coup, and it consolidated so much power under the Guggenheim name that the government eventually began to look very closely at their operations. And it wasn't just about making money, it was about declaring it at the height of their influence. The family built for mansions on a single estate in Long Island. The centerpiece was Hempstead House, a 50,000 square foot Tudor-style fortress with 40 rooms, a 60-foot tall foyer, and imported antiques from all over Europe. In the Great Hall sat an original Wurlitzer organ, surrounded by Rembrandts and Rubens. These weren't homes, they were palaces built to outlast the mining rush. In fact, their architecture would later become part of their ultimate legacy. But more on that later. The key to the Guggenheim success wasn't just the mining, it was the timing. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were a period of explosive industrial growth. The world needed metal for railroads, telegraphs, weaponry, factories, and eventually skyscrapers. And every time a wire was strung or a building framed, the Guggenheims profited. They weren't just in the right place, they built the place. But this empire wasn't powered by one man alone. It was engineered by 7 brothers, each with a specific role. Each one managing a different limb of the beast, from shipping to finance to politics. And their synchronized rise would mark one of the most efficient, family-run enterprises in modern history. So who were these brothers? Where did they come from? And how did they manage to wield such enormous power without a single title of nobility? Answer that. We need to dig deeper into the roots of this dynasty, into their family, their education, and the mindset that transformed poverty into planetary influence. By the early 20th century, Meyer had created something very few families ever do, an empire run entirely by blood. 7 brothers, each with a role, each with a mission, each with an instinct for domination. Daniel Guggenheim was the architect, the quiet tactician who understood that raw material meant nothing without control over processing. He led the charge to build the American Smelting and Refining Company, a $100 million operation that swallowed rivals whole. Under his leadership, the family expanded to Alaska, Bolivia, Mexico, and the Congo. Solomon Guggenheim had a different talent. He turned capital into culture. More on that in a moment. Simon, Benjamin, Robert, Murray, and William each ran parts of the global machine moving metals, managing politics, and securing deals in regions where American businessmen feared to step together. The Guggenheim brothers formed a private boardroom that functioned like a shadow government of the mining world. But what made them truly different wasn't just coordination, it was education. Their father, Meyer, wasn't college educated, but he believed that knowledge was ammunition, so he made sure his sons studied engineering, finance, and international law. They didn't just run mines. They anticipated how governments would regulate them. They weren't just businessmen. They were intellectual warriors armed with data, foresight, and ruthlessness. And yet, for all their brilliance, the real turning point came not from books, but from borders. The Guggenheim Empire didn't begin with a gold mine or a copper deal. It began with a boy carrying lace in a suitcase, knocking on doors. When Meyer Guggenheim arrived in the United States in 1847, he was 19 years old, penniless, and barely spoke English. Like many immigrants, he started with nothing but ambition. He began peddling household goods around the mining towns of Pennsylvania: buttons, kitchen utensils, sewing supplies. His profits were measured in cents, not dollars. But he watched closely. He learned fast, and he refused to stay small. Within a decade, Meyer transitioned from door-to-door sales into wholesale distribution, setting up a small import business. His first real break came through Swiss embroidery and lace, a product he understood from Europe. he sent two of his sons, Isaac and Daniel, back to Switzerland to set up textile factories and began importing directly. Within a few years, that single trade channel was bringing in over $100,000 annually, a massive sum for the time. But Meyer's next move would change everything. In 1881, a Colorado mine owner able to pay a debt offered Meyer a 50% stake in two silver mines in exchange. The mines were considered marginal, and the debt was only worth about $20,000. Meyer almost walked away, but something about the opportunity seemed different, so he accepted. He then invested an additional $20,000 of his own money to make the mines operational. That $40,000 total investment, an enormous risk for someone whose business still relied on textiles, ended up producing over $500,000 in silver within 2 years. The return was staggering, and it revealed something crucial to Meyer. The real wealth wasn't in trading goods. It was in owning the raw materials themselves. But mining wasn't without its bottlenecks. The silver had to be smelted, a process that turned ore into usable metal. Smelting companies charged high fees, often cutting deep into the miners' profits. Meyer, ever the strategist, wasn't going to leave money on the table, so in 1889, he built his first smelter in Pueblo, Colorado. It cost nearly $300,000 to construct, a massive capital investment at the time. But it gave the Guggenheims control over both ends of the business, extraction and processing. Within 2 years, that single facility was bringing in over $1 million in annual profits, and it marked the beginning of the Guggenheim's fully integrated industrial strategy. And Meyer wasn't done yet. In 1895, he expanded further south, building a second smelter in Aguascalientes, Mexico. This location was no accident. Mexico was rich in ore, but its export laws favored domestic processing. By refining the ore locally, Meyer avoided U.S. tariffs and locked in enormous supply contracts while cutting competitors out of the equation. The plant reportedly paid for itself within 3 years and remained one of the most profitable facilities in the family's portfolio. This process, mining, refining, shipping, selling all in-house, became the Guggenheim blueprint. No reliance on third parties, no middlemen, just total control of the value chain. In 1891, Meyer consolidated his holdings into the Guggenheim Exploration Company, with his sons acting as senior partners. The business grew fast. By 1901, the family had gained a controlling stake in the American Smelting and Refining Company, ASARCO, the largest and most important metal processing firm in the United States. The purchase was valued at over $10 million, an almost unheard of figure at the time, and it gave the Guggenheims unprecedented market power. ASARCO controlled smelters from Utah to New Jersey, and soon it would operate mines and plants in Mexico, Chile, Bolivia, and even Africa. By 1918, ASARCO was valued at more than $100 million, and the Guggenheims, through their holding companies, controlled the majority of its stock, their profits. Difficult to measure precisely, but historian estimates suggest that between 1890 and 1920, the Guggenheim family may have earned over $200 million in personal income, nearly $4 billion today, in just one generation. But they also mastered something other families failed to see: international leverage. In Mexico, they built smelters just beyond U.S. tariff zones, dodging taxes with the precision of a chess grandmaster. In South America, they negotiated deals with governments to control copper and tin at massive scale. And in Alaska, they founded the Yukon Gold Company and extracted resources before American regulators could even catch up. At their peak, the Guggenheims controlled up to 80% of the world's copper, silver, and lead production. That's not just dominance, that's monopoly. Together, they functioned like an industrial council. Their meetings were more like boardroom summits. Reports were meticulously documented. Foreign ventures were evaluated like war strategies. They weren't family businessmen. They were industrial tacticians. One defining moment came in 1912, when the Guggenheims financed a major expansion into Chile, then the world's richest copper region. They spent $6 million building the Chuquicamata copper mine, the largest open-pit copper mine in the world at the time. Within just 5 years, it was producing nearly 30% of the world's copper. And here's the kicker: while most companies were borrowing to fund projects, the Guggenheims paid cash. By the time Meyer passed away in 1905, his sons were already running one of the most profitable private empires in American history. But with that kind of wealth came a new challenge. What do you do when you've conquered the world's resources? For the next generation of Guggenheims, the answer wasn't more industry. It was something else entirely: legacy, art, culture, a softer but no less powerful form of influence. And one brother in particular, Solomon, would trade metallurgy for modernism in a way no one saw coming. The answer: art, politics, and something even more permanent. You wouldn't expect the man who controlled smelters, railroads, and global shipping routes to also be the one who would redefine modern art in America. But that's exactly what happened. Solomon, or Guggenheim, born in 1861, was raised inside the iron machinery of the family's empire. From the outside, he looked like just another one of Meyer's 7 industrial sons, wealthy, disciplined, molded by the empire. In his early career, he played his role without complaint. He studied abroad in Switzerland, partnered in the family's embroidery business, and later oversaw parts of the Guggenheim mining operations in Alaska and Colorado. Solomon Guggenheim didn't see metal as the endgame. He saw it as a means to something greater. While his brothers built smelters, Solomon quietly collected art pieces so radical, they confused critics and inspired generations. His early collecting was cautious, but in 1926, everything changed. That year, Solomon met Baroness Hilaribe, a German artist and art advisor who introduced him to the emerging wave of non-objective painting art that didn't try to represent reality, but instead communicated emotion, ideas, and energy. This wasn't about portraits or landscapes. This was art as thought, art as revolution. In 1937, he founded the Solomon R. Guggenheim Foundation. 2 years later, the first museum opened not in some industrial park, but in Manhattan. And then came Frank Lloyd Wright's spiral masterpiece, the Guggenheim Museum on Fifth Avenue, a glowing nautilus of modernism, floating above Central Park. Solomon wasn't just preserving art. He was rewriting what industrial wealth could become. But Solomon didn't just want a gallery. He wanted a temple. Something that would change the skyline of New York as radically as the art inside changed its viewers. In 1943, Solomon commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright, the legendary American architect, to design a permanent home for his collection. Wright's vision was nothing short of revolutionary: a spiral structure, fluid and organic, rising like a seashell on Manhattan's Fifth Avenue. It was a radical break from the square, boxy museums of the past. It took over 15 years to complete. Wright died before it opened. So did Solomon. His niece, Peggy Guggenheim, would take this further, rescuing modernist masterpieces from fascist Europe, building a collection that now sits in Venice, and discovering artists like Jackson Pollock when no one else would fund them. In 1959, a decade after Solomon's death, the Guggenheim Museum opened its doors, an architectural and cultural landmark that announced, without apology, that America's industrial fortunes had found a second life in the arts. The titanium-clad Guggenheim Bilbao, designed by Frank Gehry, helped turn a fading industrial town into a global cultural destination. The Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice, housed in Solomon's niece's palazzo, holds masterpieces by Picasso, Pollock, and Dali. None of this was inevitable. It happened because one Guggenheim walked away from the family's factories and found something even more enduring than ore. This transformation from smelters to sculpture, from lead to light, is what truly sets the Guggenheims apart. They didn't just accumulate wealth. They reprogrammed what wealth could do in a single generation. They had gone from mining silver out of the mountains to becoming custodians of human creativity. But there was still one more layer to their power influence beyond art. Because while Solomon was building his museum, other Guggenheim brothers were shaping media, politics, and diplomacy. One became a U.S. senator, another ran a global newspaper empire, and their ventures reached far beyond the canvas. To understand how the Guggenheims extended their reach into every corner of elite life, from Capitol Hill to European nobility, we have to follow the rest of the family. Because the next generation didn't just preserve wealth, they rebranded it into power. While Solomon Guggenheim was reshaping the art world, the rest of the family wasn't staying idle. They were quietly infiltrating the halls of government, media, and global diplomacy, the invisible networks where real power lives. Because once you've secured industrial dominance and cultural prestige, there's only one realm left to conquer: influence itself. The shift began with John Simon Guggenheim, the fourth son of patriarch Meyer Guggenheim. John didn't follow his brothers into metallurgy or mining. He had different ambitions, political ones. After cutting his teeth as a buyer for the family's smelting firm in Colorado, John ran for governor of the state in 1898. The race turned violent. Riots broke out at the Republican convention, leaving one man dead and several wounded. John lost the nomination, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he regrouped and won a seat in the United States Senate in 1907, serving a full term until 1913. As a senator, John advocated for the family's mining interests, but he also secured long-term relationships in Washington. Back in New York, his younger brother, Harry Frank Guggenheim, chose a more modern weapon: media. But perhaps the most surprising chapter came through Daniel and Florence Guggenheim's foundation. In the 1920s, they began funding space research, supporting a little-known scientist named Robert Goddard, who was working on liquid-fueled rockets. In 1940, Harry co-founded Newsday, a local paper based in Long Island. On paper, it seemed like a simple project, something to keep his wife, Alicia Patterson, busy. But under her leadership, Newsday became a regional powerhouse. It exposed corruption, reported boldly, and carved out its own place in America's increasingly partisan media landscape. Harry's influence reached far beyond the newsroom. He was a close advisor to multiple U.S. presidents, a major donor to defense projects, and an early backer of aviation technology. He even served as U.S. ambassador to Cuba under President Hoover. But Newsday was his quiet power move. In a world where public opinion could be shaped in headlines, owning a newspaper meant owning the narrative. But perhaps the most audacious transformation of all came from the women of the Guggenheim family, at a time when wealth and power were almost entirely male-dominated. One Guggenheim woman carved her name into the center of European aristocracy, Elaine Guggenheim, daughter of Solomon, who became Lady Castle Stuart after marrying Arthur Stuart, 7th Earl Castle Stuart, in 1920. Through this marriage, Guggenheim, fortune fused with old-world British nobility, a transaction that offered one side cash and the other side clout. Between 1930 and 1941, they poured funding into Robert H. Goddard, a little-known physicist obsessed with rocket propulsion. At the time, most scientists dismissed Goddard's work as science fiction. But Daniel Guggenheim believed, and I-10 put up the money. The investment paid off in ways no one could have imagined. Goddard's breakthroughs in liquid-fueled rockets laid the groundwork for modern space travel. And years later, when the U.S. government began building missiles and launching spacecraft, it used many of Goddard's ideas, sparking a lawsuit from the Guggenheim-funded estate that ended in a multi-million-dollar government settlement. In other words, while the Guggenheims once dug into the earth for metal, they were now launching humanity into space. But not every chapter of their legacy was filled with triumph. The family's wealth, influence, and eccentricity came with a price, especially for those who didn't fit the mold. Peggy Guggenheim, Solomon's niece, was a trailblazer in her own right, but a black sheep in the eyes of her conservative relatives. She rejected high society for Parisian cafes and bohemian circles, collecting emerging artists like Jackson Pollock and Max Ernst. Her personal life was chaotic. She threw lavish parties, took countless lovers, and made headlines as a scandalous socialite. But her eye for talent was unmatched. She gave early shows to artists that are now considered icons. And her museum in Venice, housed in a palazzo on the Grand Canal, is now considered one of the world's greatest collections of 20th century modern art. Even in rebellion, Guggenheim shaped culture. Understand how the Guggenheim dynasty achieved immortality. We have to look at what they left behind, not in bank accounts or government offices, but in museums, monuments, and foundations that still shape the world to this day. And yet, behind all of this, was still the original question: how much power is enough? Stand beneath the oculus of the Solomon, our Guggenheim Museum, in New York City, where the white spiral of Frank Lloyd Wright's design wraps around you like a seashell suspended in midair and it hits you. This is no longer just a museum. It's a monument to reinvention. Because long after the smelters cooled and the mines dried up, the Guggenheim name remained. Inside the family, later generations struggled with identity. Some, like Peggy Guggenheim, used art as a rebellion. Others faded into quiet wealth, lost in the shadow of ancestors who had once moved continents. Some of their children never found a place inside the machinery of legacy, too rich to struggle, too different to fit in. Their fortune had once been built on risk, brutality, and domination. They employed child labor in South America. They profited from colonial resource extraction in Africa, and their smelting plants, especially in Mexico and Utah, left behind scars, both physical and ecological. Those parts of the story don't show up on museum brochures. But even that was part of the evolution. Because the Guggenheims didn't just erase their industrial past, they buried it beneath beauty. It's a sleight of hand only the wealthiest families can pull off. Rewrite the memory by replacing it. Over time, the spiral museums and art donations began to speak louder than the old smelters and debt collections. And yet, what the Guggenheims created does have meaning. The art they preserved, the museums they built, the science they funded, the lives they changed, not by mining mountains, but by backing rocket scientists, abstract painters, and rebellious daughters. This is the true cost of immortality. You don't just build a monument. You sacrifice the thing that made you rich in the first place. You leave it behind. You bury it. And then you build something that people can admire without guilt. The Guggenheim name went from stamped copper ingots to engraved marble plaques. That's not just evolution, it's strategy. They saw that raw wealth doesn't last, but a story, a legacy, that lives forever. And that's the secret most billionaires never figure out. Because when the ore runs dry and the bank balance is flattened out, when nobody remembers what your company did, what they'll remember is what you stood for, what you left behind, the institutions you built, the culture you touched. That's what the Guggenheim brothers understood before anyone else. Wealth fades, but names, etched into stone, wrapped in architecture, spoken inside galleries, those echo for generations. So next time you walk past the Guggenheim Museum in New York, or Venice, or Bilbao, just remember, You're not just looking at a building, you're looking at the remains of a metal empire, melted down into legacy, the final product of a family that turned aura, smoke, into sculpture, dirt into dignity, and that is the price and the power of immortality. The name Guggenheim feels almost weightless floating through the air of modern art museums, echoed in hushed voices beneath glass ceilings. But behind that soft name was a dynasty forged in fire, pressure, and precision. They weren't royalty, they weren't elected, and yet, for a time, they moved markets, made presidents take meetings, and determined what the world would value both in dollars and in beauty, because in the end, the Guggenheim brothers didn't just mine the earth, they mined permanence.